Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
All righty. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all to the picturesque panoramic view of Potomac here at the Doubletree Hotel. I can't think of a more appropriate location for our workshop here this afternoon, which is the urgency of now. Environmental justice, climate justice, and the fight for our future. Today's workshop, we have an amazing panel of professionals, lay people, and I think we're going to have a very, very well done presentation today. So let me begin with my introductions, and please hold your applause until the end. The first one is, oh, by the way, my name is Isaac Chandler. I am the Isaac Chandler that you've heard about. Don't believe everything that you've heard. All right. First, we have Mr. William J. Barber III. He is an environmental and climate justice scholar and advocate with nearly a decade of social justice organizing experience and deep academic training in both the science and the law behind environmental and climate issues. William founded the Rural Beacon Initiative, LLC, which is a multi-member startup that provides consultation for groups looking to advance equity, climate justice, and environmental justice. Next, Jose Aguto, who is the executive director for the Catholic Climate Covenant, which animates the church's call for us to love and care for God's creation and our vulnerable neighbors as integral dimensions of the Catholic faith. Before joining the covenant, Jose worked for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the National Congress of American Indians, and EPA's American Indian Environmental Office. And finally, we have Eliane Lakam, who is a community organizer and consultant on gender-responsive policies with a background in peace and security, housing and climate justice, and education in emergencies. Her work focuses on advancing nonviolence and promoting women's participation as critical factors in all efforts to achieve sustainable peace and justice. She is part of the DC Peace Team, Pax Christi Metro DC Baltimore, and has founded Women of Color Advancing Nonviolence and Climate Action. Would you all please join me in welcoming these three panelists to the stage?
Hear me?
Kind of.
Thanks, technology. Thank you, Isaac, for the introduction, and to all of you for joining us physically or remotely today for this important and timely conversation of pressing modern ecological challenges. I would like to begin by acknowledging the people whose land we stand on during this conference, namely the Nakochtan or Anacostan and all those who came before us. Well, you may have heard the terms environmental justice or climate justice, or phrases such as there's no planet B, or climate justice is racial justice. But what do these terms and phrases actually mean? And why should that mean for us as Catholics? Well, today's workshop will explore these questions and more. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis encyclical on the environment, and more formally on care for our common home, the Holy Father acknowledged the urgency and the extent of the ecological challenge we face and invite us to a radical ecological conversion. A conversion that unapologetically breaks the cycle of violence, careless exploitation, and selfishness. A conversion that recognize that environmental and climate justice is a moral issue. A conversion that builds on the foundation of active nonviolence with respect to our interaction with one another and the earth. A conversion that recognizes that climate justice is social justice and ensure that the lives of the poor are protected from the consumption of the rich. A conversion that recognizes that care for creation is also a matter of racial justice, and that we can achieve environmental justice without addressing the system that actively work against racial justice. As Pope Francis pointed out in nearly 180 pages, everything in the world is connected, and protecting the earth and our brothers and sisters who inhabit it is part of our duty as Catholics. But how are we going to respond to this urgent call? We can learn from a person who came before us and whose life and legacy truly embody the theme of this conference and the spirit of this workshop. Sister Dorothy Stan. Born in Ohio in 1931 and naturalized Brazilian, Sister Dorothy Stan was a member of the Sister of Notre Dame of Namur and a fierce advocate for the poor and the environment. She dedicated her life to defending the Brazilian rice forest and from depletion from agriculture, and worked with rural peasants to develop and implement effective strategies for living self-sufficient lives and using the land in a more sustainable way. Unfortunately, Sister Stan was brutally assassinated in February 2005 by two gunmen hired by wealthy landowners to silence her and put an end to her ministry on behalf of the poor, farmer, and the environment. She was 73. The circumstances of her death are a testimony of her commitment to nonviolence and the promotion of human dignity. As the gunman approached her and asked her if she had a weapon, she answered yes, grabbed her Bible, and began to read the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Blessed are the peacemakers. And then she looked at the man standing in her way and said, God bless you, my son. While she's not officially canonized by the Catholic Church, she is revered as a saint throughout Brazil and far beyond. In 2008, she was posthumously awarded the United Nations Human Rights Prize for her role in defending the landless and poor. Pope Francis chose February 12, 2020, the 15th anniversary of Dorothy Stan martyrdom, to issue his reflection on the Amazonian Synod. I like to say that Sister Stan was a force for justice that demanded reckoning. As someone who grew up in Africa, in communities that rely mostly on agriculture for survival, I am no stranger to the impact of deforestation and grateful for Sister Stan's work. I hope you find some hope in learning more about her contribution. She was a woman ahead of her time who understood interconnectedness and the importance of caring for our common home and our brothers and sisters, especially the most vulnerable ones. Seeing through the prism of justice also looked like Sister Stan's vision for the people and the planet. May her life and legacy inspire us to become active, nonviolent agents of environmental justice and equity for all. Blessed are the peacemakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll pass it now to William to get us started. Enjoy the conversation.
Can we give another round of applause for Eliane? say good afternoon to you all, my friends at Pastor Christie, people of faith here standing in a moment of urgent and desperate times. I want to give thanks to Janice, to Michelle, esteemed panelists, Duffy Marie, all of those who have coordinated this event, which is an important conversation for where we are today. So I want to just have a conversation. I really don't want to lecture. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And one thing I want to ask you all is to dive in with me on this experience of breaking out of thinking in singularities. A little bit of background. So I am personally Black, Caucasian, and Indigenous American. So as my natural state, I don't believe in singularities. Thinking in singularities. Also, when we think about the current state of affairs, I believe in what I call the three crises of poverty, climate, and democracy, and how they intersect. And hopefully today's conversation will give you all a little bit of an inlet into that way of thinking. So can you all join me in this journey today for about 30 minutes in breaking out of singularities? Sound good? Sound good, great. Next slide, please. So just diving right in, I first want to start a conversation on why, when we see the global climate crisis, we have to understand that as an issue of morality, as an issue of spirituality, as an issue of faith. This quote by Mike Tidwell and Rabbi David Schreiner in 2021 really sums it up. It says, our faith traditions, all of our faith traditions, teach us that the earth is a sacred gift and that human communities are only whole when no one is left behind. Unbridled climate change mocks these moral precepts. And that quote really speaks to me when we think about, what is at the root of the global climate crisis. And one of the most damning aspects of it is the notion, forgetting the notion of interconnectedness. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. I also want to ground us in the encyclical letter Aguto of the Holy Father Pope Francis on care for our common home. He says, it, meaning climate change, represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades. Many of the poor live in areas particularly affected by phenomena related to warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystemic services, such as agriculture, such as fishing, such as forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is very limited. So at its core, the climate crisis is a crisis that impacts people who are already made vulnerable. It serves as a multiplier on deep-seated existing social inequities. Pope Francis also speaks to us as people of faith and goes on to say, sadly, there is widespread indifference to such suffering, which is even now taking place throughout our world. Our lack of response to these tragedies involve our brothers and sisters, getting to that notion of interconnectedness, points to the loss of that sense of responsibility by our fellow men and women upon which all civil society is founded. Next slide, please. When you look at the Laudato Si, there are actually three spiritual struggles that Pope Francis alludes to that make the global climate crisis a spiritual crisis. Franciscan Father Daniel P. Horn states that one of those is the struggle to recognize our interconnectedness. Quran states that there is a phrase, integral ecology, which is the idea that everything is connected. This pertains as much to the non-human world as it does to the human world in the age of globalization. One of the great spiritual struggles of the climate crisis is that it creates a separation between the human world and the non-human world. But it also drives wedges of division between we who are not experiencing the concerns of climate as present day and our brothers and sisters who are living with the ever-present reality. The second spiritual struggle that is alluded to is the struggle of indifference by people of faith in the face of massive humanitarian crisis. It is the individual and collective inaction, which includes a failure to embrace what the Pope calls the necessary ecological conversion, required for us to begin seeing the world in a new way, required for us to understand the climate crisis for the dark reality that it is, but more importantly, requiring us and providing us with a sense of urgency in which to act. And then the third struggle that makes the global climate crisis a spiritual crisis is the struggle of excluding serious spiritual reflection on the cry of the earth when we see extreme weather happen, when we see the increased heat waves, when we see the increased hurricanes, when we see the devastation, and the cry of the poor, when we see communities being continuously displaced by these present phenomena. We know that this sort of artificial separation, where we pray about what is sacred, but leave what is so-called secular, or we have the supernatural separated from the natural, this leads to exclude serious spiritual reflection on what is our call as people of faith in this moment of global climate crisis. Indeed, the climate crisis will not be solved by prayer alone, but the fact that we have separated, taking intentional time to reflect, to pray, to think, to hear at a spiritual level what the present reality says to us as people of faith, as a cohort, as a remnant, as God's vessels on earth, is one of the struggles of the climate crisis. And I would dare say that indeed this separation is especially sinister because it is often this practice of separating the spiritual from the present reality that leads to a degree of ineffectiveness in the movements that we've seen evolve up to this point to address climate change, where we see climate change framed as simply an issue of science, or simply an issue of policy, or simply an issue of dollars and economics. And we remove the human element. We remove the spiritual cause. And in doing so, we actually surrender one of our strongest tools that call us to collective action when we most need it. Next slide, please. There's a lot of conjecture where people say, where has that surrendering really originated? And some point to, how many people have heard of the Dominion scriptures? I'm sure.
What?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How many people have heard of the call to stewardship? Maybe say it that way. Okay, more hands for them. Great. But see, out there, there actually has been a widespread heretical view of Genesis 1:26-28, a misinterpretation, if you will. In a 1967 essay titled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crises, Lynn White argued that Christianity was an anthropocentric religion which could be blamed for our ecological crises. He said that the call to dominion in that first chapter of Genesis actually led to a moral misnomer where people believed that they were the highest form of creation on the planet, that all of creation was only here for human consumption, and it was called to be subdued by any means necessary. And that same ethos can often be seen in our early economic systems, in our early spiritual systems, in our early models of economic philosophy. However, this view of humans having dominion rather than stewardship has often been rooted in a flawed interpretation of the original Hebrew. Let's read it. Genesis 1:26-28 says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill. That's Mark, we're going to come back there. Fill the earth and subdue it. And have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, one of the first major indictments as to why the theory of dominion is flawed is facially seen in the text, where it said, God said, let us make man, male and female, in our image. And the image of God in that chapter is one of creator. It is one of creator. It is not one of dominion. And when we think about the ramifications of unbridled dominion, that does not match creation. It leads to disruption and destruction. In 2015, the church, under Pope Francis's guidance, finally addressed the issue squarely when Pope Francis issued an encyclical, Laudato Si, Mi Signore, or Praise Be to You, that stated the biblical text must be read in their context with an appropriate hermeneutic, recognizing that they tell us to till and keep the garden of the world. That's seen later in Genesis 2:15. Tilling refers to cultivation, to plowing, to working. Stewardship, while keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. Stewardship. This implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. This is further solidified when you actually look at the original Hebrew that is placed in the text. There are two interpretations that have been debated for this scripture. One is use of the Hebrew word kabash, which suggests subduing, but is only used in the context of dealing with a hostile enemy. The other original Hebrew term was rada, or dominion. However, it is only used in the royal sense, with a charge of responsibility, where kings have dominion over their subjects and territories. It means to have dominion, to rule, to have authority to rule, but is used in the scriptures to depict a ruler that is a just ruler. It is used to depict one who is righteous in their rule, one who serves and implements the image of God as Savior. So when we take that in its full context, rather than giving human beings rights over nature, these verses give us the responsibility to care for nature in a way that is consistent with God's will. And while Genesis 1:26-28 suggests that human beings have a special place in creation and a special role, that is absolutely true. It does not necessarily follow that they have more value than the rest of creation. Interconnectedness. Our interpretation of how human beings bear the image of God, and the most popular view, says that human beings are like God because they perform the functions of God and are God's representatives. As God's representatives, this chapter indicates more of a caretaking or stewardship role. it gives us a responsibility to care for nature in a way that is consistent with God's will. Now, to that little red mark that we said we were coming back to, feel. It's a very, very detailed analysis you have to do that. The original scripture actually doesn't say feel. It says replenish. So take a second and reread the scripture, but replace feel with the word replenish. Different meaning, right? Different meaning, right? And again, taken in its full context, we see that even in Holy Scripture, this notion of dominion is flawed. The call to stewardship in God's image rings clear. Next slide, please. And the beautiful thing is we see this in the Holy Scriptures of Christianity, the Abrahamic faiths, but across multiple faith traditions, this call to stewardship. We see it in the Holy Scripture of Islam where it says, and do not commit abuse on the earth, spreading corruption, in the Quran, chapter 20, verse 60. See it in the Buddhist teachings where protecting the environment is listed, explicitly listed as part of the Dharma or duty of people of faith. We see it in the Christian scriptures, again, where it says, you shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. We see it in indigenous faith traditions that teach us about interconnectedness, that teach us these concepts of not just seeing Earth as an object for us to consume, but relating to Earth as Mother Earth, relating to the Creator. We see this reconciliation between people and the natural world, where Earth is not just an object and a resource for our own development. It is a piece of who we are, and we are a piece of it. So when we talk about why action on the climate crisis must be an issue of faith and spirituality, it's because across the board, our faith traditions give us some of our most robust calls to take in this moment seriously. Next slide, please. So that's going to set the tone for the rest of the conversation, but I do want to kind of transition and segue this section of the presentation with some resources for faith leaders. So this website is the Forum on Religion and Ecology. Anyone seen this? Good. That's some good folks. But it has resources compiled for every major world religion on what faith traditions say about climate and environmental activism, and also what different bodies of faith are currently doing to meet those calls. So I would very much encourage you all to take a look at this website. It has been both a source of inspiration and accountability for me in my personal work. All right, next slide, please. All right, got the spiritual. So y'all shake off a little bit, get the heavy stuff. All right. So now we're going to get into some of the science. Everybody got this? You need the website again?
Yeah.
All right, let's go back one. Can you go back one?
Yeah.
All right. So next slide, please. So now, the question is, what do we do in the midst of climate crisis with these collective calls for stewardship from our faith traditions, from various walks of our life? Well, I think the first thing we must do is to seek adequate understanding of the crisis so that we may act. So that we may act as we are called. So we're going to dive into a very quick rundown of some of the basics. Next slide, please. Y'all see that? Isn't that a lovely image?
Yeah.
Talk about interconnectedness. All of us are on that single blue dot. So what this represents is the first home movie taken by the Galileo robotic satellite going to explore the solar system. It's beautiful dot, blue dot spinning in space. Essentially, it gives a core element of understanding of the climate crisis is everything that is happening. When we talk about climate crisis, the extreme weather, the warming of our atmosphere, the displacement of people, it's all happening right there on that blue dot. Nowhere else. We don't have anywhere else to go. That's where we all are. Next slide, please. Second image. This image represents the true nature of the atmosphere. So when we walk outside and we actually look up at the sky, for those of us who have not necessarily studied this up close, the sky seems like this vast, limitless expanse, right? It just goes on and on and on forever. But this image shows that what we think is this vast, infinite expanse is actually a very thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet, and that we, human beings, are actually capable of changing its chemical composition. And we are currently in the process of doing so. Next slide, please. Diving into some of the basics of the science behind global warming. So solar radiation in the form of light waves passes through the atmosphere. This is energy that comes from the sun. It comes right through the atmosphere, hits the planet, and warms the planet. Next slide, please. Most of this radiation, in a normal scenario, is absorbed by the Earth, which then warms it. Next slide, please. Some of this energy is reflected back into space by the Earth in form of infrared waves. Next slide. Some of this energy in a normal scenario is trapped by that thin shell of atmosphere and warms it. It's what gives us the normal spectrum of temperatures on the planet. However, we're changing that dynamic. Next slide, please. As we change the chemical composition of that thin shell, as the CO2 concentration increases, more and more and more of that outgoing infrared radiation is then trapped. It cannot escape. It cannot be released back into space. So it is trapped here on the planet, and it contributes to the warming of our Earth, the rising of our temperatures. Next slide, please. Now this connects it to human activity. The largest source of that global warming pollution is by far our use of fossil fuels. As you can see, this represents the coal, the oil, and the gas. And if you pay attention to the dates, you will notice that after World War II, the use of fossil fuels expanded quickly and dramatically, and the release of CO2 in the atmosphere began to increase. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, you will see that there was a brief, very brief period where we had about 3 years of emissions being stable. Some afford that to economic downturns, some afford that to the pandemic, but now those emissions are going back up again. Next slide, please. Some quick statistics to hammer this home. These speak for themselves. CO2 is being released into the atmosphere faster than any time in at least the last 66 million years. Next slide. This statistic really blows me away, pun intended. The energy trapped by man-made global warming pollution right now is now equivalent to exploding 500,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs per day, every day, 365 days per year. Now, big atmosphere, but as we saw, it's not limitless. And that is a lot, that is an incredible amount of energy that we are introducing. Now, what are the effects of those? Next slide, please. So, this is a simple bell curve, and it shows what has been the normal distribution of temperatures of the Earth. It's arbitrarily chosen as the period between 1951 and 1980, but you see a pretty standard breakdown, what you would expect. The blue represent your cooler than average days, the white are your average temperature days, and The red are your warmer than average days. Next slide, please. So, as time goes on, thank you. As time goes on, the whole thing shifts to the warm side. In the lower right-hand corner, the dark red, this is the first time we get a statistically significant number of extremely hot days. Next slide, please. In the 1990s, the curve shifts again to the warm side. Next slide, please.
Oops.
And then most recently, in the last 10 years, it shifts even further, with the added effect that the extremely hot days have become significantly more numerous than the cooler than average days. We still have cool days. We still have even very cold days, but the preponderance is that our temperatures are warmer than average and hotter than average and extremely hot. In fact, extremely hot days are now almost 150 times more common than they were just 30 years ago. Next slide, please. And we also see that the extreme temperature events cover a significantly larger portion of the planet. They used to cover only 0.1% of the planet. They now cover approximately 14.5%. Wow. Next slide. Some stats that speak for themselves. At least 224 locations around the world set all-time heat records in 2022. Interconnectedness. What affects one of us is affecting all of us. We are all bound together by this present experience. You cannot escape. We're all on that one blue dot. All of us. Next slide, please. We talked about the multiplier effect of climate change, how it serves to multiply on deep-seated social inequities. In that same encyclical letter, Pope Francis said, the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest amongst us, the most vulnerable. Next slide, please. We're going to do a quick exercise over these next 3 slides, and I ask you all just to pay attention visually to some of the hotspotting areas and where they're occurring. So, this map represents a simple map of census data. It's the Black or African American population for counties. And you can see the beginnings of this hotspotting area in the southeastern United States. Now, if you're a student of sociology, student of history, you know that this corresponds with an area known as the what?
Barber belt.
Barber belt. Another belt.
Deep South. Cotton.
Deep South.
Cotton belt.
Cotton.
Cotton belt. Another belt. Black belt. Somebody who said it? Black belt. Now, actually, did you know the black belt reference doesn't refer to the people, but the soil? Because the soil is so carbon rich. But pay attention to this hotspot. Next slide, please. All right. Another map of census data. And I'm sorry, timekeeper, I saw that 5 minutes, but I'm about to blow that all the way up. I apologize. Now, next slide is the percent of poverty per county. Now, this represents the counties that exist in what is called persistent poverty, meaning that children of 2-parent households in these counties have a greater than 50% chance of existing at a lower economic station than their parents did. So it's a vicious race to the bottom of poverty. And we see where those hotspotting events occur. Now, next slide, please. This data is oftentimes less seen. This data represents the billion-dollar weather and climate disasters experienced across the nation. Now, can we run through those 3 slides one more time? Just pay attention to these hotspotting areas. Next slide. Next slide. So, the data tells us a story. That when we talk about the communities that are currently seeing the greatest, most expensive, most disastrous effects of climate change, right here, just taking the United States, They are largely communities of color. They are largely communities in the South. They are largely rural, coastal communities, and they are largely poor. This is the front lines of the climate crisis. Next slide, please. All right, we get into solutions. That was section 2. Y'all still with me?
Yep.
All right, shake it off, okay. Now, that translates to the beginning of conversations around environmental justice, climate justice. What does that actually mean? Very quickly, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, regardless of color, regardless of national origin or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Environmental justice is achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, in which to learn, in which to work. Next slide, please. Now, climate justice is a narrative that it breaks us out of singularities. It makes the connection between the environmental crisis and other socioeconomic crises. Climate justice forces us to understand that the climate crisis is, yes, an environmental issue, but is also a social issue, is also an economic issue, is also an issue of racial equity, is also an issue of gender equity. The lens focuses on the root causes of the climate crisis, including an economy heavily dependent on the exploitation of fossil fuels, deeply embedded structural racism, and other social inequities. The lens calls for solutions which center the priorities and the voices of the most impacted communities. Key components of a climate justice narrative are people-centered. It acknowledges disproportionate impacts and identifies intersecting oppressions and issues. We're going to skip the next 2 slides. This is just a brief history of the environmental justice movement. We'll share that information. And we're just going to run through these very quickly. When we look at the current state of things, remember those maps, keep those in the back of your head. Right now, what do we see? The U.S. Southeast was projected to warm up to 8 degrees Fahrenheit this century. Same areas of front lines. Communities of color, poor communities. It's going to get worse. Next slide, please. 3 of the top 5 biggest carbon polluters in the U.S. electricity sector are headquartered where? In the South, right there on the front lines. They're Duke, Energy, and Southern. Next slide, please.
What are they again?
Duke, Energy,
Energy, okay.
and Southern Utility.
Okay.
Next slide, please. Of the 100 U.S. counties projected to suffer the worst impacts of the climate crisis, 97% located in the South. Next slide, please. Again, go back to those hotspots. Just click through those maps, please. Economic losses from extreme weather. When people say, in this argument, what is the cost? Right? We've heard a lot of that. What is the cost of solving climate change? That's the wrong question. We should ask the question, what is the cost of not solving it?
Yep.
Right now, economic losses from extreme weather total $653 billion over the past 2 years alone. That's just the beginning. Next slide, please. I'm going to end on this 3rd slide. Next slide. Now, this is something that, again, unites us in the urgency. These 4 crops together make up 2/3 of human caloric intake worldwide. And we see the effects of climate change. What happens is that there is significant yield declines for each 1 degree C of warming, meaning that food insecurity becomes more prevalent, food costs rise, and there is an entire disruption of food access. You see corn for every 1 degree C has a decline of 7.4%, wheat has a decline of 6%, rice 3.2%, soy 3.1%. This is also exacerbated when we talk about sea level rising and the unavailability of land to continue to grow agriculture. Next slide. Global impacts. The Lancet Countdown report said that we could see up to 1 billion climate migrants. You all, we think we have a immigration problem now. 1 billion. Next slide, please. It's just an image of migrants from Central America making their way towards the United States. And our policy is still rooted in an unawareness, or rather an erasing of the interconnectedness. Next slide, please. This just demonstrates where many of the migrants are coming from in North America. Many of them are coming from the area known as the Dry Corridor. It's an area that is experiencing significant disruptions right now in food security, which leads to political unrest, which leads to people moving away, just trying to survive. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates areas that were affected by drought. I'm going to do 2 more impact slides and then just close us out on solutions. Next slide, please. We bring the environmental justice component back home. Right now, 78% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal power plant. Next slide. Let's get through that one and let these speak for themselves. Next slide. Next slide. African Americans are exposed to 21% more air pollution than the overall population. Hispanic Americans are exposed to 12% more. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of time. Thank you all for bearing with me here, because this history is important. When we think about why certain communities have been placed and made more vulnerable to the current impacts of climate change, we have to recognize that they are not victims. They are communities that I say have often been victimized as the result of intentional bad policy decisions that have often been rooted in structural racism, political exploitation, and economic exclusion, have locked communities into highly impacted, highly exposed locations for generations. The great cruelty of the climate crisis is the same communities that right now are experiencing the physical manifestations and disruption are the same communities that have borne the brunt of our placement of legacy polluting fossil fuel infrastructure. Same communities that contributed the least to the overall crisis. Take redlining, for example. Everybody knows what redlining is, right? Okay. We know what it is. I'm going to skip the definition. We know that this government policy had a clear racial disparity as places where high populations of blacks or immigrants lived, or were simply adjacent to those areas, were colored red to indicate that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. We are familiar with that. However, what is less known is that in the underwriting manual, which established the explicitly segregationist policies as a part of the redlining recommendations, also said that an effective tool in separating black and immigrant communities from white neighborhoods would be the placement of highways. How does that connect to climate change? Well, beginning in the early 1930s, highways were preferentially constructed through black and brown communities, over black and brown communities. Entire communities were actually bulldozed for preferred placement of our national highway system. Communities like Freedmanstown in North Dallas, Texas, West Belford in Houston, West Oakland in California. And today, highways are a significant source of air pollution with communities of color. The same communities that were redlined are now being disproportionately exposed to vehicular air pollution. According to a recent study, inequitable exposure to air pollution by the Union of Concerned Scientists, African Americans are once again 34% more exposed. Latinos are exposed to 26% more, and potentially surprising, Asian Americans are exposed to 36% more air pollution. This also had an added effect of opening the gates to community disruption and the beginnings of disproportionate placement of fossil fuel infrastructure. We said that those highways were placed over communities of color. These highways in turn served as channels of commerce along which the emerging big industry sought to develop. Polluting entities that looked to place operations in areas that were both near these channels of commerce, but also did not have the political or financial wealth to offer significant resistance. So because communities and color were not allowed to generate wealth through home ownership because of redlining, they were placed to be more vulnerable to these encroachments. So a vicious feedback loop of inequity is put in place. That's how you get 68% of African Americans living within 30 miles of a coal-fired plant. That's how you get African Americans being 75% more likely than white people to live in frontline communities close to oil and gas infrastructure. That's where we see the beginnings of these comorbidities begin to take place. Higher exposures to air pollution and lower exposures to green space over the course of generations, because highways and factories and plants and pipelines are not green, they're concrete. We then see exposure to heat waves, risk there. Thereby, this phenomenon that happened, this one bad policy decision that happened over a century ago, becomes the norm, generation after generation after generation. And now, to be fair, people say, well, why don't people just move? Well, one, they don't have the resources to move.
Right.
Two, to be fair, we do see the occasional instance of progress where a family or generation is able to break the cycle, relocate, and see a better existence. But that is the exception, not the norm. And it is nowhere near the scale of disruption that one bad policy catalyzed. And my grandfather, he used to play a little pool. Y'all don't tell anybody. But he used to say, if you're shooting pool and someone tips the table on the back legs and asks you to take the shot, you just might have the occasional person who makes the shot. But the success of the occasional shot doesn't mean that's how we should play pool. The occasional story of triumph from these communities doesn't mean that's how we should treat these communities or develop for the future. Our policy is wrong. Next slide, please. Wrapping up. This quote from Van Jones talks about, puts us in context, a crisis, but in the frame of what is the opportunity here. And he says it like this: the green economy should not just be about reclaiming thrown away stuff. It should be about reclaiming thrown away communities. It should not just be about recycling things to give them a second life. We should also be gathering up people and giving them a second chance. In other words, we should use the transition to a better energy strategy as an opportunity to create a better economy and a better country all around. Next slide, please. What are some of the opportunities we see? When we think about the scale of investment, I call it the critical coalescence of consciousness and capital to solve climate change. Talk about liberation. But we see opportunities to unleash local economies. We see opportunities to have more diverse businesses that are better for workers and communities. We see opportunities to scale climate solutions in a way that centers communities that have too often been disinvested. We see data that shows us that community scale solutions are shown to generate larger benefits when done in conjunction with other development activities. What are the other opportunities we're looking at? Next slide, please. When we think about what is on the table in terms of resources, the current and future energy transition to a clean energy economy represents the emergence of a multi-trillion-dollar market on the scale of 50 to 131 trillion dollars. Comparatively, the entire Internet of Things was valued at only $8.9 trillion in 2020. So with this transition, which sits on a scale of multiple times the entire market of the Internet of Things, we have an opportunity of capital at an unprecedented scale on the table to begin to redress some, not all, but some of the harm that was historically locked into these communities. And we have to take that opportunity. We have to take that opportunity. Next slide. Next slide. Let's get this next slide. Some recommended reading as I begin to close. These are 4 resources that really get to that notion of breaking out of singularities and interconnectedness. The first is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It talks about the history of redlining and how it has perpetuated until today. Second is A New Reality, Human Evolution for a Sustainable Future by Jonas and Jonathan Salk. Third is A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind by Harriet A. Washington. And the fourth is Justice, Equity, and Sustainability published by MIT Press, the 2016 edition. That should be 16. And to leave on a note of inspiration, next slide please, directly impacted communities are fighting back. They're not twiddling their thumbs, they're not sitting and continuing to remain victims, they are leading efforts on the ground. So who are we not to? Next slide please. This is a group from Union Hill, Virginia. A little story about Union Hill. No one knew of Union Hill, Virginia a few years ago. It was a small, formerly town of freedmen. So individuals who were enslaved, settled here post the Civil War, and basically created this community. This site of Union Hill was slated to be the location for the largest natural gas compressor station on the East Coast. And they came together, built a community, built a movement that literally was not only able to see victory and prevent that from happening, but redefined what pipeline opposition looked like in the region. Next slide, please. Others are coming together and building similar coalitions. Next slide. New policies are coming forth. I would encourage you all to take a look at these 3 policies. The Vision for an Equitable and Just Climate Future by the National Climate Platform. Next slide. Gulf South for a Green New Deal. Next slide. The Poor People's Campaign, Poor People's Jubilee Platform. Next slide. And of course, the Justice for the Initiative. And what I would say is 2 things. Is 1, our faith, our role as people of faith, calls us in this moment to urgent action. It does not call us to despair. It calls us to vigorous and urgent action. And we must realize that the scale of the current crisis is of such that no one sector of society can do it on its own. Communities cannot do it on its own. Government cannot do it on its own. The private sector cannot do it on its own. Private finance cannot do it on its own. Science cannot do it on its own. Faith cannot do it on its own. We have to really re-embrace this notion of interconnectedness and building a global movement, a new global polity to meet this moment. And it can start right here in this room. Thank you.
Perspective, the Capitol.
Yep.
Right now, the Senate is talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and that has been my organization's and our Catholic partners focus for the past 2 weeks. And it delves into a lot of the solutions that to some of the problems that William has been talking about, both with regard to the climate crisis as well as environmental justice. And I want to talk about those and some actions that you can take right now to support this bill, which does have the support of some significant environmental justice organizations as well. It is really transformational legislation. Before I get into that, first, William, thank you so much for the multidimensional wisdom that you brought to all of us today. And yes. And I only hope to supplement some of which you've talked about, and my words are good, and pleasing to God and pleasing to all of you. To William's point about us as people of faith and what we can bring to these times and times immemorial. I used to work for tribes on climate issues and was feeling at one point that Congress was not listening to them, even though they have some of the most tragic implications and impacts of climate change upon them. And feeling like there wasn't a sufficient moral call to act on climate. And so then I moved into the faith space, first working with the Quakers and now working with the Catholic Climate Covenant, because I believe, and I think many of us do, and I actually had this conversation, Heather, with your friend Melissa yesterday, that it's actually not new wisdom that we need to adopt. We need to delve more deeply into the old wisdom, which is the greatest commandment, which is to love God, the Creator, with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is the greatest commandment. And it is still that ancient wisdom that we must continue to practice and carry forth in our daily lives and in all of the work that we do. And you mentioned, for example, Sister Dorothy Stang, who, in front of her persecutors, in front of her murderers, she was exhibiting love, and she was talking about the Beatitudes, and it is that kind of incredible moral courage that comes from our faith, that comes from creation, that is the unique gift that we carry within ourselves that we need to continue to take out into the world. And as St. Francis's peace prayer says, where there is darkness, let us sow light. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. And as Martin Luther King has said, hate cannot dispel hate, only love can do that. Darkness cannot dispel darkness, only light can do that. That is our mission into this world always and for time immemorial. And when we do that,